of the cardboard cutout.
Right. All right, we're
Yep.
recording.
All right, thank you. Greetings and welcome to this workshop on making friends with your gradebook. Today we will be looking at how to do an initial setup for a new gradebook, how to add items to the gradebook, and then how you can do a quick check to make sure your gradebook is set up properly. What we won't be covering today is entering grades and troubleshooting gradebook problems. The latter is very important, especially for courses that you've already started. When working on a live gradebook, it is very easy to corrupt your grades. So once the semester has started, we highly encourage you to seek out assistance through help@oswego.edu or our regular office hours to help resolve any issues. Finally, we have a lot to get through today, so I will ask that you hold questions until the end if possible. And with that, let's get started. Maybe. There. So whenever you work with a grade book, we generally say that it's a good idea to have a syllabus in front of you. So hopefully you have something like this that lays out what types of assignments you have, how many you have, what the points per the assignment is, and then how everything adds up at the end of the day. So once we have that available, we're going to go ahead and open up a course in Brightspace, and we're going to start by going to the gradebook itself. The easiest, there's a couple ways you can get there, but eventually you should wind up on this page. Now, if this is the first time you've ever worked on a gradebook, it is going to automatically put you in the setup wizard. Otherwise, you'll normally end up on the Enter Grades tab. But this is fine because the setup wizard is actually where we want to start. And you can always go through the setup wizard again just by clicking on setup wizard up here in the top. And I'm actually going to change my layout briefly. So all of this is just what the current gradebook settings are. So we're going to go down and start the wizard again so that we can make our own settings. Now, the first question is simply whether you're running a weighted gradebook or a points-based gradebook. Points-based gradebooks are very easy to understand. Every assignment has its points. All of those points add up to some score, and your final grade is X number of points out of that score. Weighted grade books are a little bit more complicated in that the points don't matter as much. What matters is what you set each group of assignments, what we call a category, as value. So all of your assignments might be in one category and be worth 30% of your grade or something like that. We don't really use formulas, so it's going to be one of these two. And since it's the more complicated one, I'm going to go with a weighted gradebook for this demonstration. Now, the second option really just asks you what you want students to see as their final grade. Do you want them to see what the calculated grade is, where Brightspace does all the work, or do you want them to see a grade that you've manually entered? Usually, at least for most of the semester, we would leave it on calculated final grade. And then if you want to do curving or anything like that at the end of the semester, you might change it to adjusted final grade. We also usually want our students to see what their final grade is and have it updated to what it currently is. So usually we'll keep this option checked so that they will always see their final grade. Now, this one is an important one. Depending on when the course was created, it may have treat ungraded items as 0 set as the default. The problem with this is it starts every student from an F, so it kind of freaks them out. And it also doesn't play well with the starfish system. So we'd encourage you to change this to drop ungraded items. This means that if a student has not done an assignment, it won't be counted until there's actually a grade in there. The only thing this means is as the course goes on, you want to enter zeros in manually for various students. And then generally speaking, we want the final grade to be automatically updated as grades are entered. This step simply says, okay, students will by default get a score. So a 70 out of 100. Do you want that to be translated into a letter grade for the student? So a C, or do you want it to simply show them a percentage? Usually we find it easiest to leave this on a percentage, but there are lots of options for what students see if you want to explore them. And all you have to do to explore something is just hit these preview buttons on the side, and you'll get a little pop-up that tells you what the schema is for that one. For now, we're going to keep it as percentage and continue. I have honestly never used this function or never changed this function. I like whole numbers, so I like something to be 62 out of 100 rather 6.2 out of 10. But this simply says how detailed do you want to be when you start seeing decimal points. Now, this asks what students actually see on their gradebook view. Broadly speaking, in most cases, we want them to see their raw points and we want them to see their percentage. What's a little misleading is we don't want them to see this weighted grade. It is a calculated grade that is very confusing and not of much use. I don't know of anybody that actually looks at that and says, hey, that's great. So usually we will simply go with points grade and the percentage, or in some cases, just percentage. Again, you don't really need to worry about the rest of these settings. And I actually usually do not display the final grade calculation. That's really only valid in weighted grade books. And what it does is simply reiterate what's already in your syllabus, hopefully that X is worth 20%, Y is worth 30%, etc. And the last step is simply an overview of everything that you just changed. And so we're just going to finish that. And now we can go to enter grades and we'll see everybody in our class and some basic information based on what settings we made. Now, one thing we did not change in the setup wizard is how you, the faculty member, sees the course. And if you want to adjust that, you can go to the settings tab over here and simply check the items you want to see. So I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to turn off the weighted grade. The rest of this is just some changes based on how you want to see the grades. So now we have a gradebook view. And so next we're going to go to manage grades. Manage grades is where you actually make changes to the gradebook as opposed to seeing what students do and entering in grades. And the first thing we're going to look at is, let's say I'm using this for an item that's not in the course. So maybe it's a face-to-face course and I've offered a paper, but I want to take those grades and put them into Brightspace. In that case, I would go new item. And I'm almost always going to select numeric. And the only things I need to do is give it a name and say, how many points do I want it to be out of? Now, since this is a percentage-based gradebook, I can also set a weight, but I'm not going to worry about that right now, and I'll explain why in a second. Can exceed simply lets me grade over 100. Bonus means it will be treated as extra credit, so it's actually added onto the final grade after everything else. I'm not going to worry about the rest of these settings for now, and I'm just going to create this. And now I have an assignment. But as I said, since this is a percentage-based grade book, I want everything to be in buckets. So I'm going to go back to sharing my full screen. And I'm going to reference my syllabus over here to create those buckets. So this time I'm going to go new category. And I'm just going to create some categories. Now, generally speaking, I'm going to want the second or third option, where for the third one, it distributes the weight evenly regardless of the number of points. The second option will distribute the weight of each assignment in a category based on the point value. So if I have one assignment that's worth 10 and one assignment that's worth 100, within that category, this would make one assignment worth 10 times more than the other. And these are generally going to be the easiest two to use. I always like the last one because it keeps things simple and it allows me to drop the highest and lowest grades as I wish. And so I'm just going to create two more of these real quick. So now you can see I have 3 categories and 1 assignment, but oops, I also entered in one of those weights incorrectly. But now I can immediately see that I'm getting some notes up here because my weights are adding up to 110, and that is because I have this assignment floating out here in the middle of nowhere. So I'm going to edit this assignment and move it into one of those categories. And that's why the individual percentage value of that assignment doesn't matter, because it's going to be overwritten by the percentage of assigned to the category. Presuming I have all my settings right. So now I have a category that's got now I have a grade book that has 3 categories in it that all add up to 100%, which is good. And one of those has an assignment in it, which has 100 points and counts for 100% of this assignment. This is where things get a little confusing. Basically, if I added another assignment in here, this would change to 50 because each assignment is making up 50% of that category. So let's talk about getting the rest of the stuff into the gradebook. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create some different types of assessments. So I'm going to start with an assignment, and I'm going to create a new assignment. And then what happens is when I enter how many points I want to grade this out of, I automatically have the option to put this into the gradebook. And I can really just leave that alone. And then I'm just going to give it some random instructions and make it live and close that. And back in my gradebook, I now have the assignment that I just created. The one downside is there's not a good way at the creation stage to tell it what category to go into. So I'm always going to come back here and move it into the proper category when I'm done. And I'll come back and show you a fast way to do that in a second. The next thing I'm going to create is a discussion. Now the interface on here is slightly different. In that once I've created my discussion prompt, I actually go to the assessment tab. And here I tell it I want to create a new grade item. And this version's a little nicer in that I can tell it what category I want something to go in immediately. But one thing to make sure of is that whatever value your discussion is graded out of, the same number of points is used here. So you'll see now that I've created the grade item, I also have a space here to say how much it's graded out of. I always want to make sure those two numbers are the same. Otherwise, it will interpolate the numbers if it's different. So if I put 10 here and 100 in the grade book, it would change a 9 to a 90, and it will probably screw up your grade book in some way, shape, or form. So the easiest course of action is just to make sure that this equals whatever you put in the grade book. I would recommend against using allow individual assessment of posts unless you talk to an instructional designer. The way that interacts with the gradebook is a little different. So you can do it, but it's much easier to use the holistic grading option instead. So again, if we go to the grades, we can see that example discussion has been put in, and because of the different way it was created, it actually goes right into the category it's supposed to be. Last but not least, we have quizzes. And you'll see the points that a quiz is graded out of is dependent on the number of points for the questions. So I cannot change the points value here. If I want to change the points value, I have to change the value of the individual questions. And you'll see that updates the point value. And then I'm going to change this from not in the grade book to add to grade book. And that will automatically create the item in the grade book, and it'll be out of, I'm going to adjust that back down to 10 points. And I'm going to save and close that. And just going to name that quickly. And again, this has gone straight into my grade. But similar to the assignments, I did not have the option to put that into a into a category, so I have to do that after the fact. You'll also notice I made a mistake and didn't name it properly when I saved it. And even though I updated the name at the assignment level, that does not push into the gradebook. So you do have to be careful about your naming conventions as well, because if you change it in one place, it does not change it into the other. So now I have two, actually just double check one thing. Okay. So now I have two assignments that aren't in the right place. Now I can always handle assignments individually by just grabbing the pull down menu and clicking edit. And that will give me my ability to change the name, change the category, and change the point values and so on and so forth. But if I'm working with multiple items, I can simply put check marks next to each one and bulk edit them. And here I can change the name. So I happen to know this one I want to be example discussion. I can change the points and weights technically, but more importantly for my purposes, I can put these into the folders that I want them to go in. And then I simply save it. And now I'm back to having a gradebook that all of the weights add up to 100. If I was using a points-based grade book, I simply wouldn't see this column. I'd be working from this column instead. And that is that. Okay, so one thing that you need to be a little careful of when you're creating a grade book is that you do see options to hide things. And this is especially bad on the discussions setup, but it happens to some extent on all of them. Actually, I don't know that it does that anymore. All right, let me show you on the discussion one because it's easier to see that on this one. So when I create a discussion, I may want to hide that discussion from students. And I would do that using the restrictions tab. And this restrictions tab directly hides the discussion from users. However, in the assessment tab, there is also an option when you create a grade item to set release dates on the grade item. This has nothing to do with access to the discussion itself. What these settings do is actually hide the item from students in the gradebook. So students will not be able to look at their grade. Now, there may occasionally be reasons that you want to do that, but just make sure you know which setting that you're using. And if you do accidentally hide something from yourself, or from students rather, it will look like this. So it will have this little eyeball with a slash through it. You will only see this on managed grades. You won't see it in enter grades, but if you see this icon, that means students are not seeing that right there. So generally speaking, we want our students to see their grades. So we'll just turn that back on. So now let's say I've gotten to the point where I've put all of my grades together. Let me just make a quick change here. But they're not in the order that I want. One thing to keep in mind is the order that you see in managed grades is the order that students see things in. So let's say I want them to see homework first. So in that case, I'm going to go to more actions and reorder. And unfortunately, this is not a drag and drop interface. For various reasons, it's a numeric interface. But all I have to do is say, okay, I want a homework to be first in line. The numbers on the other ones will update. Let's say I actually want these reversed as well. And then when I hit save, it should reorder things for me in the way that I want. So fairly straightforward there. Now, last but not least, you might run into cases where you've accidentally created something in the gradebook that you don't want, or that is from a previous semester, or something like that. The first thing to know is that if an item is associated, meaning that it's actually connected to something in the course, so this is connected to a real assignment, I cannot delete this. Now, this one is not connected to anything, so I can delete that. And the way I would do that is go to More Actions, Delete. Then anything that I can delete, will allow me to check. Things that I can't delete, I won't be able to check mark. So you see, I can't put a check mark there. And then I just click delete, and that item will be gone. As always, be very careful deleting anything. If there are grades in a column and you delete it, those grades are gone. We cannot recover them. Now, if you have something that has an association on it, as I said, you cannot delete it. It has to be unlinked. And that is the kind of situation where, again, I would
But looks like we lost him. What Doug was saying though is if it's a situation where something is linked and it doesn't belong, it is something that you would want to attend one of our Zoom office hours for assistance. Let's see.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. I'm gonna
Yeah,
pause the recording, but you're here.
No, my camera crashed. Never
Oh,
had that happen before.
Carrie filled in
The need to request help from us.
Okay. Very good. All right, so that was a very quick introduction on how to set up a gradebook. So now I want to shift gears and talk about sort of reviewing your gradebook at the start of a semester or something like that. So the first thing I would do is, let's say I'm coming into a course and I want to look at the gradebook. Again, I'm going to go to Course Tools and Grades, and then to Manage Grades. And the first thing I want to look for are any symbols on the right of my course. So I'm going to show you a different course briefly. And these are the symbols next to an item that you might see. The first one, as we already discussed, simply means that that item is hidden. If you see a clock, that means that item has a date release on it. So unless you're inside these dates, again, that item is hidden. A star means something is being checked for extra credit. So it is not included in the grade unless you've actually except as extra credit at the end. So you can see it's not being included in my point values. It's just on top. And then the last option means that an item is not connected to the gradebook at all. Basically, it is in the gradebook. You can show it to students if you want, but it does not affect the calculated averages. So you might use that to keep track of ungraded work or participation work, or simply to show students information that you don't want to be part of the regular gradebook for any number of reasons. So each of these is addressed in a different way. The most common ones, and the ones we'll talk about really quickly, are the restriction settings. Again, the hiding setting is simply a toggle. So I can turn that on and off simply by making something visible to users. The other ones are all controlled through the edit option. So my restrictions are on the second tab. So this is where I could turn off date releases or adjust them if I do actually want to use them. And see, now that's gone. And the other two are controlled by these toggles. So you see I have 3 toggles. One lets it go over whatever the maximum score is. One treats it as extra credit. One excludes it from the grade calculation. Now, I will say you may not always see this option. It cannot be used in some locations in weighted grade books. Again, if you want something to be excluded from the grade book, that's a great time to come see us and say, hey, I have a question. Now, the next thing that we look at are the associations. So this is a fairly quick way to tell, number one, is my course item actually linked? So is this pointing to something? Because if it's not pointing to anything, and you enter in a grade in the system, it's not going to show up in the grade book. Again, if you're creating a standalone item, it will not be associated and you'll enter in grades manually. The other thing is just kind of a quick check to make sure things are what you think they are and that they're where they are. So, for example, I use my naming convention to say example discussion, and I can see that's a discussion. My quiz or my test is a quiz. If I see something that says example discussion and it says quiz, that might be an indication that I made a mistake somewhere. Similarly, I can really easily see what category each thing is in. So I can see my assignments are in my homework category, my discussions are in my discussion category, and my quizzes are in my test category. If I had a quiz in my discussion category, that's probably not right, in which case I can simply edit it and drop it into whatever category it's supposed to be in. Then I can look at my points. Are all of my points accurate? And again, this is when I would review my syllabus to make sure all those numbers are accurate. Do my weights all equal 100? Hopefully they do. If they don't, I can go in and check each of my weighted numbers. And you'll see if for whatever reason things don't add up the way you would expect them to, the system will start throwing notes at you. Now, a note does not necessarily mean that something is broken or that it won't work. It simply means that it's something that you might want to take a look at. So in this case, I've changed some settings so I can see that my final graded calculation is not adding up to 100%. It's only adding up to 85%. Probably made a mistake in one of my weights. Let's see if I can get it to throw another error. Okay, in this case, I overrode a setting so that right now it's telling me that all of the assignments that I have are not in tests. So sorry, all my quizzes and tests are not equaling 100. Now, again, this will not break anything. It'll simply treat this as 100 for the moment, or it'll handle things in a different way, but it may indicate that there's some sort of issue that I should look at and address. Now, the other thing that I always like to check is whether or not the point values that I've assigned to things line up with their point values in the gradebook. And this is a great time to use split screens. So first thing I'm going to do is just duplicate my tab and drag it over a little bit. And now there's a really neat trick where as long as I'm selecting this window, if I hit my Windows key and the right mouse button, it will automatically move that over to the right half of my screen. And I can do the same thing with any screen. If I click on it and use the window and the left and right arrows, I can move it to take up half of my screen. I apologize, I do not know what command does that on Apple. But in this case, I can now see my two screens, and so I'm going to keep one screen on my gradebook, and I'm going to use my other screen to go look at my assignments. And I'm going to edit my assignment, and all I want to know is, does this number equal what's in the gradebook? And it does. I'm happy. If this did not equal what was in the gradebook, I would be unhappy because that will cause problems for you. Unfortunately, I am not aware of any way to do these checks in bulk. It really is going through each assignment and double checking, then going through each discussion and double checking. Again, the grade books are set up a little differently, so I have to click on the assessment tab to see that number. Again, 10 over there. And 10 over here. And then, of course, I made some changes to my quiz. So when I go look at my quiz, okay, so the quizzes again are a little different in that what I did was I overrode the point values in the grade book, which changed this number. But now this number is not equaling the number of question points that I have. So you can see how this would really quickly confuse a student in terms of I have questions that are worth 10 points, but then that grade is being transposed to being out of 8 points. And it would confuse me, I'll say that much. So I'm going to change that so that that matches, and that should push the change back to the grade book. It did. So now I have completed a quick check on my grade book. And the last issue that I still see on the right-hand side is that my final grade is only adding up to 85%. So I would go back to that sheet that I have and look and see that my tests should equal 30%. Whoops, they're only equaling 15%. So I'm going, oops, 15%. So I'm going to go and override that. I'm editing the category and I'm just changing the category weight to 30, and I'm making sure things are distributed evenly. And now you see that note has gone away. So again, this is really just meant to let you see whether or not the system is working. And obviously, if you're comfortable doing it, there is some very basic troubleshooting that you can do. But I'd still encourage you that if you see anything that's wrong and it's not really obvious, to come in and see an instructional designer or Kathy Dutton during our office hours, or send an email to help@oswego.edu, because it's really easy to go down a rabbit hole where suddenly various different things in your gradebook just aren't working and you aren't sure why. And even more importantly, if you've started grading work and you have grades in the gradebook, please come see us, because when you start trying to change a live gradebook, it's very, very easy to corrupt your grades. So that is it for me. I will open things up to my colleague for any comments or for any questions. All righty, I think we can stop the recording there.